tremendous hakaras hatov of thanks for the Rebbeinu Shalom. That you thank the HaKadosh Baruch Hu for bringing us out of Mitzrayim and giving us the opportunity and the privilege of being His chosen nation. That's a tremendous privilege. So that's hakaras hatov, and that's what we are supposed to be singing about on Pesach night, singing about the praises of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hallel. It's the only time that we say Hallel at night. It's on Pesach. It's a special time. So there are those who ask, why is it we owe hakaras hatov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What do you mean you owe hakaras hatov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Why? Because He took us out of Mitzrayim? But He was the one who put us down there to begin with. So why is that hakaras hatov? I prefer that I was never down there. Why is it hakaras hatov? So the correct answer to this is there's more than one possible answer, but the Ramchal, Rabbi Ayson explains that we would not have been able to get the Torah had we not gone through Mitzrayim, because we had too much negative baggage still. And even though that we had Avram Avinu and Yitzchak and etc. and the Avos, but we still had to rid ourselves of certain things in order to be able to stand by Sinai. And Mitzrayim was the crucible by which that we got through that. It would take too long for us to elaborate upon why that was and how that was. But suffice it to say that the crucible of Mitzrayim, the experience of being in Mitzrayim and then coming out of Mitzrayim, made us worthy and capable of then standing at Sinai and accepting the Torah and becoming God's special people. Without that entire experience, that includes the going down, the slavery, the servitude, the whole 9 yards, plus the redemption thereof, that was all part of the grand scale plan of being able to become the nation of God in the world. So that all is part of that hakaras hatov. That's all part of it. I'm actually makir tov on the slavery, as funny as that may sound. It was good for me to have the slavery, even though that we don't like that idea, right? Obviously, it wasn't pleasant, but sometimes, even if it's not pleasant, it may be good anyway. And this is an example of where it is. So really, we're supposed to be makir tov. We're supposed to thank the Rebbeinu Shalom that He gave us this entire experience, and through which we were able to get to the Torah.
Excellent. Okay, great.
Okay, that did what you needed?
Oh, we're ready to go over here. This is ready. This is going.
Oh, okay.
Ready to go. We
are up to part 11. Okay, so we'll make a very quick summary of what we did in part 10, because part 11 is a continuation of part 10 in a certain sense. Okay, if you remember that the discussion in part 10 was a discussion about taking truma. When a person goes into somebody else's property and takes truma for him. Now the Gemara, in the conclusion of the Gemara, said that was referring to when he had permission. He was granted permission. He was made into an agent to do that. However, he was not given specific instructions. If you remember that was the Gemara before. And the question was, if he was not given specific instructions, was he able to just take things and assign them, or, basically say, okay, this is truma. Well, is he acting on behalf of the Baal Habayis or not? So then we said that was dependent on the Baal Habayis's the owner's reaction, right? What was his reaction? If his reaction was favorable, then it's good. If his reaction was negative, so then it's no good, because he is now not acting in the best interest of the Baal HaBayis, of the owner. Okay. And if he is not acting in the best interest of the Baal HaBayis, of the owner, so then it would come out to be not good truma, because he was actually a ganef, he was actually taking something which he had no right to do, because albeit that it's true that the owner did assign him to do it, but he assigned him to do it as a shliach, as in the best interest of the Baal HaBayis. If he was not acting in the best interest of the Baal HaBayis, then it's no good. Right? Good? Okay. Now, let's go into the Gemara will often do this, that will go off in a tangent, something which is related to this and go off on a tangent, even though that it is somewhat of a tangent to the main body of the discussion. The main body of the discussion is Yeush Midaas, right? But now the Gemara is going to go off on a tangent which is relevant to what we just finished talking about, taking off Truma. It's an interesting little tangent, and the Gemara does this because the Gemara does a lot of things that are strange unless you know the secret. The secret is that everything in the Gemara was memorized. It was originally committed to memory. And people memorize things based on memory tools and associations. So you mention this, so this gets memorized along with it by association. So even though that we wouldn't have written the book like that, but it was originally thought to be memorized. That's why the Gemara in numerous places will bring down a statement from someone and then bring down several other statements from that one person, even though it was completely irrelevant to the discussion that we were having. The reason is because they were memorized as a group of this person said such and such and such and such and that's and such and such and such and such and such and such. So it was all memorized because that was the person who was doing it. It's all because it was memory, right? People who don't know that say, this is crazy. Why does the Gemara go off on these tangents? They have nothing to do with anything. Why is it here? Well, now you know the reason. That's the reason. Okay, so here's another example. But it's a curious little Gemara. Ameimar Umar Zutra V'Ravashi. So they were three Gedolei Hador, three great people. This was towards the end of the Amoraic period. Rav Ashi, of course, being the one who was the author, collator, chief architect of the Talmud, of course, we all know. So this is in his time. So Ameimar, Marzutra, and Rav Ashi, Iklu, they all went, they all occurred, or they all visited Lebustana, to the orchard to Mori Barisik, of Mori Barisik. Mori Barisik was apparently a very wealthy man, and obviously he owned the orchards, and he was a powerful person, and apparently that they had reason to go over there. The Gemara does not discuss why they traveled over there, why they wanted to meet with this Mori Barisik. For our purposes, it's irrelevant why they wanted to do it. For whatever reason that they felt it was necessary to talk to Mori Barisik, they went there. Okay, so what happens? So here's the little story. I see Arisei brought his oris. His oris, Arisei, means his oris. In Aramaic, the A at the end, the Yud Hey at the end means his. Oris is a sharecropper. Just as a brief explanation, a sharecropper is basically a farmhand. The people hired farmhands to help them, harvest the fruits, grow, plant, all sorts of things that they hired people for. And they had different types of ways of paying these people. One of them is sharecropper. Sharecropper meaning that he gets a share of the crop as payment at the end of the season. So that's an oris. Okay, it doesn't really matter. It was his worker, right? Basically, Mori Barisik had a sharecropper who was there, and he brought out, I see Arise, brought out his sharecropper, meaning his sharecropper brought out Tamare. We had that before. Tamare means dates, Virimone, and pomegranates. Vishada Kamayu, and he placed them before them. Okay. So evidently that the Oris came, this sharecropper, he saw that these three very chashuv rabbis came to visit Mari Barisik. Evidently Mari Barisik wasn't there yet. Okay, so the sharecropper felt that, hey, such great Rabbanim came to visit Mari Barisik. You have to show a little hospitality after all, right? So he took some dates and he took some pomegranates and he placed it before these three great Rabbanim. Okay, so imagine the scene. They're sitting there by the table, right? And the sharecropper has given them some nice fruits to eat, right? And they're sitting there, and apparently they're waiting until the Balabas, meaning Mari Barisik, shows up. So the Gemara says over this following story: Ameimar v'Ravashi achli. Ameimar and Ravashi, 2 out of the 3 people, they ate. They partook of the fruits that the sharecropper placed before them. In other words, okay, good, okay, that looks good. Let me take a pomegranate, let me take some dates, right? Okay, that was the purpose of it. Marzutra lo achil. Marzutra didn't eat. Okay, now apparently it was not just because Marzutra wasn't hungry. As you will see later on, that Marzutra had a reason not to eat. Okay, as we will soon see, that there was actually a halachic reason why Marzutra had a problem with eating. Okay, we'll see that as we go along. All right, so Marzutra did not partake, but Ameimar and Ravashi did. Adahachi. Adahachi means in the meantime. Adahachi. Hachi means this. So Adahachi, as this was happening, Adahachi means in the meantime, also Mari Barisik. Came Mari Barisik, the man we've been waiting for. He shows up. Mari Barisik, the Balabas himself, apparently this wealthy man, he shows up. Okay. Ashkechinu. He finds them. Okay. All right, he walks into the house and he sees these 3 great Rabbanim, and he sees the situation, he sizes up the situation pretty quickly. And V'Amar Leila Arise, and he said to his sharecropper, he said to his worker, Amai lo Isis lehu l'Rabbanon. This is going to sound somewhat familiar. Amai, why? Lo Isis lehu l'Rabbanon. Did you not bring to them, to the rabbis, Mehanach Shapirta, from these good ones? Sound familiar? Right? Mori Barisik comes in and he says, sharecropper, why did you do that? Why did you not give them these great Rabbanim, such chashuv visitors? How come you didn't give them from those good ones, from the best of the crop? How come you didn't give them from the good ones? You gave them mediocre fruits. I mean, for such chashuv rabbanim, you have to give them much better stuff. That was what Mari Barisik said. Okay, now let's pause for a minute. What happened? What do you think is going on over here?
He's concerned the Aris didn't take Truma properly.
Or either didn't take Truma, or actually, forget about Truma for a minute. Let's think about whether the Aris was allowed to do this. Remember, Mari Barisik wasn't there. The Oris is now doing things, right? He's assuming that Mari Barisik would have wanted him to, be machnas oirach, right? Especially Chosh Rabbanim, right? So now the question is, was he warranted in what he did? That the Oris now took some stuff, placed in front of them, presumably that Mari Barisik would have wanted this to happen, right? But he actually was doing this without his knowledge a little bit, right? Okay. So now the question is, so now the question is, was he allowed to do that? So Amru le Meimar v'Ravashi the Marzutra. Ameimer and Ravashi now said to Marzutra, he was the one who didn't eat, right? Hashta, now, Amai, why, lo achil mar? How come the master didn't eat? Referring to him in third person, out of honor. But he's saying, Marzutra, how come you don't eat now? V'atanya, but didn't we learn in a brisa, im nimtzu yafos mehem, trumas or truma? If better ones were found, then we say that his truma was a good truma. Now, let's just pause for a minute. We're not discussing the halachas of truma here per se, but what is Ameimer and Ravashi saying? What they're saying is, we know why you didn't eat Marzutra. You were afraid that maybe this Oris, maybe this sharecropper is not acting in the best interest of the owner of Mari Barisik, and as a result of which, you're afraid that this is a little bit of a gezel. Right? And he is taking things which he would not have allowed, the owner would not have preferred him to do. And now it's going to come out that this sharecropper is giving them stuff which is gezel. And Marzutra was suspicious that maybe that would be true, and therefore Marzutra refused to eat any of it, because he didn't want to partake of something which was improperly given to him. Well, that was why Marzutra clearly, they understood that Marzutra wasn't not eating it because he wasn't hungry or because he doesn't like dates and pomegranates. The reason why he wasn't eating is because of this concern. So Ameimer and Rashi now turn to him and he says, no, don't you see we were right? It's a mission. We learned it before in the Brisa, right? The Brisa said, in the Brisa we learned before, that if the owner comes back and says, oh, you could have taken from the nicer ones, that indicates what? That indicates that he had a favorable response to the truma that was taken off, and hence it was fine. And therefore trumas are truma. His truma was working, his truma was valid, right? And likewise here. Likewise, we know that Mari Barisik would have wanted him to give this. As a matter of fact, not only was he pleased with what he gave him, but he said, you would have really been right to give him even better, right? And he said, why didn't you give him the Rabbanim from the best? So you see that's a favorable response. No. So it's a favorable response. That means that there's no gezel here, and that means that it was perfectly okay what he did. He got the okay, the thumbs up, and okay, so now, just like it's a valid truma in the Bryce's case, it's going to be valid over here, and therefore there was nothing wrong with why you to eat. It was perfectly fine. You hear?
So Rav Ashi could just eat right away. I mean, presumably he thought about that.
Okay, good.
So this happens.
Okay, so good. So what's happening up here? The question that Alexander is asking is a good question. He's saying that Ravashi and Amemar, they ate before, right? They ate immediately. They didn't wait for Mari Barisik. Mari Barisik now comes in, and now they look at Mar Zutra, knew, how come you're not eating now? Right? So, apparently, that they're saying, oh, so we must have been right? So, Alexander is asking, why could they eat so quickly? Why did they eat immediately? Should they have not waited also, at least to see Mari Barisik's response, right? That's what you're asking. So I think the answer to that is that Amemar and Ravashi, they immediately said that this is not a Shiloh. It's not a Shiloh. Why is it not a Shiloh? Because it's a davar pasha to them that Mari Barisik would have wanted to give them as is appropriate for Haknas Sarchim. Is appropriate. And it's a davar pasha. By Truma, where this is something which is a tithe to the Kayin, and some people look at it like a tax. So they don't want to give away their hard-earned money, but when it comes to Choshev Rabbanim, it was a davar pasha to them that he would be agreeable. Mar Zutra was still worried. So then what they said, after Mari Barisik came in and said what he said, so then they looked at him and he says, oh, no, so how come you're not eating now? You're still not eating. Why not? Now there's really nothing to concern yourself, right? Apparently they held that there was nothing to concern themselves to begin with. But Mar Zutra, even according to you now, but there should be no problem, because now what's their concern? I mean, did not Mari Barisik just give his thumbs up?
But shouldn't they not have been worried about the fact that whether or not the sharecropper was a valid shliach?
Well, so that's what I'm saying, that I think that what's going on here is that Amemar and Ravashi knew or felt that it was a given that Mari Barisik would have been wanting this to happen. This is not like Truma. This is a question of Haknas Sarchim and honoring Rabbanim. It was a davar pasha to them that he would have been okay with that. By Truma, where it's more like a tax, and it happens all the time, people might tend to be a little wary of giving away their best stuff. But over here, it was davar pasha that whatever was going to be fine. That Mari Barisik was not going to have any type of concerns about it, or any type of he wouldn't be remiss on this.
So it's not a Truma issue.
It's not an issue, and they felt that there was a davar pasha.
It was assumed that Truma had been taken properly from
before. Well, forget about whether the Truma had been taken before. Even given that, but it was not a problem. They felt it was a given that Mari Barisik would have been fine with whatever Haknas Zarkam was going to be afforded to them. It's almost embarrassing not to do that, right? Okay, so now Amemar and Ravashi felt there was nothing to discuss, and they could partake immediately. Even Mar Zutra, who was evidently concerned that maybe Mari Barisik would not have been happy, but they pointed out, okay, so now why aren't you eating? Now he gave his thumbs up. What's wrong with that? So the Gemara says like this. Amar lahu, so he told them back, I still have my concerns. Mar Zutra still refused to eat, despite the fact that Mari Barisik came in and said, hey, you could have given him from the better ones. So how come that wasn't a thumbs up? How come that wasn't, you just got my approval? So he says, Amar lahu. So he told him, Hachi Amar Rava. So said Rava. Lo Amru Klach Eitzel Yafos. They didn't say Klach Eitzel Yafos. In other words, this concept of when the owner comes back and he says, oh, you could have taken from the good stuff, right? That concept, they only said that. Ella le'inyan truma bilvad. They didn't say that except regarding the issue of truma alone. Meaning, Only when it came to the truma, which was the discussion in the Brisa, then yes, then if the owner comes back and says, Klach Eitzel Yafos, you could have taken the nicer ones, then that's an approval, and that says that yes, definitely you may take, right? And that was a good truma and it's valid, etc. But that's only regarding truma, says Rava. Mishum de mitzvahi, because it's a mitzvah, v'nichale, and he is happy to do it. We have a general rule that says people are happy to fulfill mitzvahs. And therefore, once he gave his approval that you could take from the good stuff, that means it was approved that he took off the truma and everything is good, and the balabayas has put basically his sign of approval on whatever the shliach did. So that's good. But that's only because truma is a mitzvah. Aval hacha. But over here, mishum ksifusahu the amar hachi. It's because of embarrassment. Ksifusa means embarrassment. That's why he said this. It's embarrassment. Now, let's explain that for a minute. What Mar Zutra is saying is, evidently, just read the words of the Gemara, what Mar Zutra is saying is, over here this might be different than Truma. And Rava actually said that there might be a difference between such cases and Truma. Truma is a mitzvah. And because Truma is a mitzvah, then if the Baal Habayis comes back, sees what the Shliach did, and he says, you could have taken from the better ones. That's a good sign, that's a sign of approval, and that's where the Brisa said, Truma, so Truma is valid and very good. Okay? But that's only because it's Truma, which is a mitzvah. But what happens if that there's an element of possible embarrassment? We're not only dealing with a mitzvah here, we're dealing with embarrassment. Now, let me just explain this a little more in detail. Hachnasas Archim is also a mitzvah, right? It's a mitzvah to do Hachnasas Archim, right? But if you've ever been in the business of having guests over your house, I'm sure that we've all had similar experiences. It's not just a matter of I want to do Hachnasas Archim like Avraham Avinu, but there's a certain element of I've got to look nice because it's embarrassing if you aren't, if you don't do a nice job, right? I've heard it said many times, I'm getting, especially my mother-in-law's coming, I better have it nice, because otherwise, goodness gracious, right? I don't want her to think that I was cheap, right? Or somebody is coming over, I don't want them to think that we don't have a nice Shabbos table or something like that, right? So you put out a nice spread. Were you really happy to put out a nice spread? Or were you doing it because you wanted to make sure that you weren't embarrassed because of the company, right?
Covered.
Your own covered.
I have my own covered.
I'm my own covered, right? So what's really happening over here? Okay, the telltale. Sometimes you can only tell with what do they do when there's no company, right? Is the Shabbos table the same way, or it's special because of the company, right? If the Shabbos table is much different when there's no company, so then you know that, it's partially because of the company. Well, that might be good, right? You want to be machnas archim, good. But also there's a certain element of, I don't want them to think lowly of me, right? So then I put on an extra good spread or extra nice, tableware or whatever have you, an extra nice.
A four-forka.
A four-forka?
4 forks, different forks.
Oh, no. Okay, yeah, okay. In order to make it look nicer, right? That's because of me, right? So, now, Mar Zutra said like this. In a case of Truma, where this is not an issue, Truma is not an issue of being embarrassed, right? It's a mitzvah, you set aside a certain amount of produce, it goes to the kohen, fine. This is a mitzvah, I'm supposed to be doing it. It's purely a mitzvah. In other words, I'm doing it for one reason only, and that is because that the Lord told me that I'm supposed to take off truma and give it to the kohen. Okay, fine. So I want to do my thing. There's no element of embarrassment, there's no element of this. I'm doing it strictly for the mitzvah. But says Mar Zutra, where actually he's quoting Rava, and he's saying, that is not necessarily a universal rule that every time that the Baal Abayis says, oh, you could have taken from the nice ones, does that automatically mean that there was consent and approval of what was happening? Because, says Rava, in a case where it's not strictly a mitzvah, where there might be the additional factor of embarrassment here, it could be that the Baal Abayis really would not have been willing to do that, but he was embarrassed not to, right? Chashav Rabbanim come and you're not going to give them the nice stuff, right? It's embarrassing. But maybe he would have said that only because they were there. And maybe it was because that they were listening. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he really felt that way. And therefore, Mar Zutra, or Rava really, was saying, just because he said Klach Eitzel Yafas does not necessarily mean that he was really nicha, he was really happy with that. And therefore you can't necessarily assume that the aris, that the sharecropper did actually in accordance with the willingness of the owner, in this case, Mari Barisik.
And then it would have been Gneva?
And therefore, well, yes, he had no right to take it. It would have been Gneva, right? Exactly.
So this is the connection between this and the previous Gemara.
That's right, exactly. So the Gemara is now basically going on a tangent and saying, by the way, we just talked about this, right? Klach Eitzel Yafos, that was considered a legitimate, consent, approval of what had been said, right? And what had been done. So now comes the Gemara and says, well, that's not so simple. It doesn't work all the time. When there's an element of embarrassment possible, then Rava says you don't necessarily have the right to assume that just because he agreed, does that mean he really agreed? Right? He might be doing it he might be acting out of embarrassment because he doesn't want to look bad. But really? No. So it comes out like this. Based on Alexander's observation before. Ameimer and Ravashi held the opposite of Mar Zutra. Ameimer and Ravashi said, we don't have to wait until Mari Barisik comes. We can assume that Mari Barisik is going to be happy to do this because it's Achnas Sarchem, and it's a davar pashut that he's going to want to do this, right? Stam das. We don't even have to concern ourselves. By Truma, we have to concern ourselves. We have to wait until the Baal Abayis comes and he gives his reaction. Was he right? Was he not right? That's because by Truma, there it's like a tithe. There it's like a tax. Maybe he's willing, maybe he's not willing. We have to see his reaction. We have to gauge his reaction. Right? Okay. But over here, of course, right? Of course, he would look like a moron if he didn't do that, right? What kind of balabas are you, right? 3 chashav rabbanim come over and you don't give them nice stuff. What's with you, right? So therefore, it was never pashut to them that you could take. And therefore, it comes out that they took, and they didn't have to wait until Mari Barisik came back and registered his reaction, right? Mar Zutra looked at it, mamish punkt fakert, mamish the opposite. And he said, no. Over here, even when you get his reaction, it's not necessarily a raya. It's not necessarily a proof. Because not only do I suspect that he wasn't happy, but even when he was happy, I suspect that it was for ulterior motives and he really wasn't happy.
Even if he wasn't happy and he had Chevrusah,
right?
Still, we do that. Like you said, people do that.
Okay. Yeah,
Would that not be a good reason?
No, that's not a good reason. The reason why it's not a good reason is because that, albeit that he might be embarrassed, right, to admit it in front of the Rabbanim that he didn't want that,
right.
But did this guy act right then in his favor?
If
Maybe
the
not.
Aris hadn't been there, it's very likely that even out of embarrassment, the Balabayas would have also served us.
Okay, but let me ask you this. What would happen if he had previous knowledge that they were coming? And right? And let's say Mari Barisik would have been home. And he knew ahead of time that they were coming. What would he have put out? Not necessarily his best stuff. Because maybe he was embarrassed to admit that in front of them, but he could have put out whatever it is. And as long as he didn't, as he gave them something, he didn't have to be caviar. He didn't have to give him the nicest stuff. He could have given him something, okay. He just
also not the nicest stuff, because it says, "Amai lo aisei lahu Rabbanim mahadach shapirta."
Right.
What he gave you.
Right. Exactly.
We didn't give him.
Right. Exactly.
Did not give him the best stuff.
Right. But so what he's trying. He right. We don't know. The point is that Mar Zutra. He would have given him something, but we don't know. Right. So in other words, Mar Zutra was saying, even when he did react, and it seemed to be that he reacted in a favorable manner, you still can't trust it. So it's come out like this, that Mar Meimar and Rav Ashi and Mar Zutra were looking at this from two different opposite directions. Meimar and Rav Ashi were looking at it, he says, it's a davar pashut, that of course, of course, it was a davar pashut that he would be okay with whatever it was, and therefore they didn't even have a suffix that you could eat right away. Mar Zutra looked at it mamish the opposite, that I suspect that when it's a truma, which is a mitzvah, so then if he gives a good response, that means he has a positive attitude towards doing the mitzvah, and that's fine, and then we can gauge his reaction based on which. But over here, there's an element of Chevrusah, there's an element of embarrassment, and in which case you don't have necessarily a right to presume that what he said was actually what he wanted. So this is an amazing thing. It's going to come out. What I like about this Gemara is, I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you. The thing that I like about this Gemara is severalfold. Number one, it just goes to show you that you have a brisa that has something to do with truma, so you think of it in terms of truma. No. This brisa can be understood in terms of understanding many other situations because it's a question of consent. So yeah, okay, it's true that the brisa is within the context of truma, but you're learning from that brisa, or either you can or you cannot learn from that brisa, this, to learn about what is and what is not considered consent into other cases. That's one thing that you learn, right? You see how the Amoraim, right, pulled from a brisa about truma to other halachas which are relevant about consent. That's one. That's one thing that I enjoyed about the Gemara. The Gemara is, when I see a concept, it becomes a universal concept. This is not just a truma issue. This is a... And then you also see how the Amoraim, right, Could you compare this? Is it a good comparison? Is it not a good comparison, right? This was all worked out and thought of as soon as they sat down, without even thinking, without even having to discuss this matter. Immediately they were already clicking in to this discussion and this issue of, is it a good comparison? Is it not a good comparison? Right? There were 10 steps ahead of us. Right? About how they thought about and what they did based on which, right? You follow? So this is it's just an amazing amazing Gemara how the Amoraim, how Talmidei Chacham think. Right? Is it a good comparison? Is it not a good comparison? Right? And it's you find this all the time. You find this that this is one of the wonderful things about hanging around Talmidei Chachamim. The Mishnah says, you're supposed to hang around Talmidei Chachamim. When you hang around Talmidei Chachamim, you see how they think, and that itself is very, very, very eye-opening. Because when you see how they think, right? It's right. You would think is a given one way, and oh no. A Talmid Chacham doesn't necessarily think of it that way, right? You see everything has its place. Whatever you hang around Talmid Chacham, it's a good thing. You see? All right. What time is it? Okay, we have a few minutes. We'll start this next thing. Okay, part 12. I don't think we'll finish it, but we'll start it. All right, now that was the side thing. That was sort of a tangent, a sidebar. Now we're going to get back to the main show, which is again Yeush Shelo Midaas. Okay, now let's give a brief intro here, which is going to be relevant to last week's parsha, actually, Parsha Shmini. Now, there is a concept of Hechsher Ochlin. Hechsher Ochlin means when you have produce, food, in order for a food to be mekabel tumah, to be able to become tameh, it has to have water been put on it. That's called being muksher lekabel tumah, making it worthy, making it ready to be mekabel tumah. And the Torah says that you have to have water put on it in order for it to be considered food. Once water was put on it after it was harvested, so then the person is, then it's muksher lekabel tumah, then it's considered prepared to be mekabel tumah. That's considered like it makes it into ready produce to eat. Okay? Now, the Brisa says as fast, Toshma, Odehu hatal aleihem, if the dew is still upon them, which means that you had produce and they were left outside, and then dew came on the produce, right? So dew fell on this produce, v'samach, and he was happy. In other words, the owner of this produce, he woke up in the morning, and it was early enough that the dew was still on it, and he took a look at it, and the dew was still on the produce. Samach, he was happy. In other words, he was pleased. Oh, that refreshened my the produce. He wasn't sad about the fact that it was that it got a little wet because of the dew. Quite the contrary, he was happy about it because it freshened it up. Harei bechiyutan. That is considered chiyutan. Now, that's the pasuk. The pasuk in Parshas Shmini says, Kiyutan mayim al zera, when water is placed, not when he places it. Kiyutan, it means if it was placed. That's just grammatically what kiyutan means. When water is placed on zera, which means just on produce, let's say wheat or any of the grains, that means water was placed on it and now it was muksher lekabel tumah, then it becomes worthy of being Mekabel Tumah. If a person who is Tameh touches it, now it can become Tameh. Good? That's the rule. That's called Kiyutan. So the Brisa says something interesting. If the dew was still on it, and then the owner comes over and he sees it and he's happy, that's considered Kiyutan. That's considered that. It is when the water was placed on, and it makes it possible to Mekabel Tumah. Nagvu, but the Brisa says, but Nagvu, what happens if they dried up? Meaning, by the time that the balabas comes out and he sees the produce, they're already dry. In other words, let's say he overslept in the morning, whatever it is, and by the time that he gets up, it's 10:30 in the morning, and meanwhile the sun is out and the dew is all gone already and everything is dried up. Afal Pisha Samach, then even though that he was happy, even though that he was pleased with the fact that he realized that dew came on and he realized that there was dew last night and he missed it, he didn't see the dew on the produce, then it's not considered Kiyutan. It's not considered like that he put on the water. That's the Brisa. Now, let me add one piece over here. That means that the Brisa is saying that there's something that you wouldn't have necessarily understood from the pasuk. The pasuk just says, when water is placed on this produce, then the produce becomes food and is worthy of accepting tumah. That's what the pasuk says. Chiyutan mayim azera, when water is placed on this grain, right? Some love, and then some dead animal touched it. Then it becomes tummy. But the Brisa is adding on an interesting factor, and that is, it's not good enough just that the water was on it. He had to be pleased with it. He had to be happy with it. He had to say, yes, this is a good thing. And moreover, the Brisa says, not only does he have to be happy with it, he had to be happy with it while it was still wet, when the water was still there. If the dew, which is water, right, came down, and by the time that this guy woke up, the dew was gone, it was all dry already, then it doesn't matter that he was happy afterwards. He says, oh, that's great, the dew came down. No, that's not good enough. He had to catch it while it was still there, right? He had to actually be happy, be pleased with the fact that the dew came down when the dew was still there at, let's say, 7:30 in the morning, right? When the dew was still there and it was still wet. Oh, terrific. The dew just freshened up my produce, right? Great.
Means you have to be conscious of it.
Yes, you had to be aware of it, and you had to see it and be happy with that happening, right? If you have all of those conditions, then it's considered kiyuta, right? Then it's considered like the water of the dew made this produce worthy of food. It has a status of food, and now I can be machshir. It's worthy of accepting tumah. Good? Now, by the way, if you caught it while it was still wet and he was happy with it, then even though the 2 hours later the dew's gone and the thing's all dry, it's already produce. Now it's already food. Now it can be Mekabel Tumah forever, right? But you had to get that status in. You had to make it a status of food by being aware of the fact that the moisture fell on it in the form of dew, for example, right? And he knew it, and while it was there, he was happy with it. Good? That's what the Bryce is saying. Okay? Now, the truth of the matter is that we're going to have to see why that is. Because from the Pasuk, you would not have necessarily seen that. From the Pasuk, it doesn't say anything about he's happy with it. It just says if water fell on it. The implication from the Pasuk would certainly, I mean, if you're reading the Pasuk simply, it doesn't give any differentiation whatsoever as to whether it is or not he was happy with it, he was pleased with it. It's irrelevant. Okay, so we're going to have to find out why where does he come in, so to speak? Why is it necessarily dependent on his happiness, whether he was willing to do it, was he willing to have it get wet or not? Right? We're going to have to see that. But what we do see is that it has to be that he catches it at the right time. He has to be awake at, let's say, 7:30 in the morning. He goes out, he sees his produce is wet from the dew, and he says, terrific. Then it's tummy. But if he wakes up at 10:30 in the morning, and then he walks out, and by that time the dew is all gone, even if he was pleased, even if he was happy, that didn't work.
Even if he knew that it was
wet. Yes. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Right? It doesn't work anymore. That's what the Bryce seems to say. So as you'll see in the Gemara, okay, we'll elaborate upon this next week, but as you'll see in the Gemara, this is going to play up with Yeush and Midaas. I mean, he knows now, at 10:30 in the morning, he knows that there was dew here, right? But yet it's not going to work retroactively. So this is going to play into the discussion, like we had before, about whether something which is for sure going to happen, but we don't know about it yet, is that valid or not? And that's going to be related to the machlokes between Abaye and Rava. Okay, but we'll elaborate upon this next time. In the meantime, have a good night and a kosher Pesach, and we'll see you after Pesach.